C-25C. To most people, it was just a number printed on a boarding pass, another anonymous seat among hundreds on Flight 739 to Washington, D.C. But for Emma Collins, it was the first seat she had occupied in peace in over a year. The soft hum of the airplane engines felt almost unreal. After months of hearing helicopters, distant gunfire, and the steady beep of medical monitors, the steady rhythm of flight was a strange kind of silence. She let her head rest back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment as the world outside disappeared into white clouds. Emma wore civilian clothes now, simple jeans and a light jacket, but underneath, folded neatly in her carry-on bag, was her military nurse's uniform, still bearing faint stains of dust and desert wind. The name tag, Collins E., had faded around the edges, but she couldn't bear to throw it away. That uniform had seen too much. Too many nights without sleep, too many whispered promises to soldiers who never opened their eyes again. The passenger beside her, a middle-aged businessman scrolling through his phone, glanced her way briefly, offering a polite smile. He had no idea who she was, and Emma didn't expect him to. To the world, she was just another traveler, a tired face in C-25C. And maybe that was how she wanted it to be. But the quiet had a weight. Every sound in the cabin, the murmur of voices, the clinking of ice in plastic cups, the soft laughter of a child in the next row, felt distant, like echoes from another life. She had left behind the chaos of war, but war had a way of following you, whispering through the cracks of peace. Emma opened her small notebook, its cover bent and edges worn, and flipped to the back page. There, written in careful handwriting, were the names of 6 soldiers. 6 souls she'd promised herself never to forget. She traced a finger over the last name, Lieutenant Ryan Keller. He had been her last patient before she left. Young, barely 25, his hands trembling as she held them in that dusty field hospital. "Tell my brother I'm proud of him," he'd whispered, just before his heartbeat faded into the monitor's long, flat tone. She had nodded through tears, though she'd never met his brother. The next morning, the medevac carried Ryan's flag-covered body away. And Emma had carried his words ever since. Now, as she sat in 25C, that memory pressed heavily on her heart. The flight attendant passed by with a warm smile. "Ma'am, can I get you something to drink?" Emma blinked, returning to the present. "Just water, please." Of course. The attendant handed her a small bottle, and Emma thanked her softly. Her hands shook slightly as she unscrewed the cap. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. The kind that no sleep could cure. Outside the window, sunlight rippled across the clouds like an endless ocean. Emma watched it in silence, remembering the faces of the soldiers who used to stare at her the same way, searching for peace somewhere beyond the horizon. Her mind drifted back to her final day at the base. The commanding officer had given her a quiet farewell, saying, "You've done your duty, Collins. Go home, rest." But home was a strange word now. Where was home, after everything she had seen? Was it the quiet streets of her small hometown in Ohio? The hospital corridors lined with familiar faces? Or was it still somewhere back there, in the dust, among the brave souls who had trusted her with their last moments? She reached into her bag and touched the edge of a folded American flag, the one given to her by Ryan Keller's unit. She had promised to deliver it to his family, but she hadn't yet found the courage. The address was in her notebook, written just below his name, Captain Mark Keller, U.S. Air Force. She didn't know much about him, only that he was stationed somewhere overseas. Maybe he was still out there, flying, unaware that his brother's last message was sitting quietly in C-25C, thousands of feet above the clouds. The plane jolted slightly, a mild bump of turbulence. A few passengers gasped, someone laughed nervously. Emma barely flinched. She had flown through far worse skies, medevac flights with engines screaming over enemy fire. Compared to that, this was calm. Almost peaceful. Almost. She looked around the cabin. Families chatting softly, a young couple sharing headphones, an elderly woman knitting beside the window. All of them wrapped in their own small worlds, untouched by the shadows she carried. It felt both comforting and isolating at once, to be surrounded by life, yet feel so detached from it. Her mind began to wander again. To the night she and her fellow medics had worked for 14 straight hours, trying to save a convoy ambushed outside the perimeter. To the way the desert wind had howled through the tents, carrying the scent of smoke and dust. To the moment she'd held a soldier's hand and whispered, "You're going home, it's okay." Even when she knew he wouldn't. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the hum of the engines, the warmth of the cabin. The world here was normal, safe. That was what she wanted to believe. But as the minutes passed, she couldn't shake a strange sense of unease. Not fear, exactly, more like an invisible thread pulling at her from somewhere far away. Something unfinished, something waiting. The captain's voice soon came through the intercom, calm and clear. Greater than, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 33,000 feet, with a smooth path ahead. We should arrive in Washington on time. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight. His voice reminded her of another pilot she'd known at the base, confident, steady, always cracking jokes before takeoff. He'd once told her, "When you're up there, Collins, the world looks too peaceful to believe in war." She smiled faintly at the memory. Maybe he was right. From this height, everything looked small, even pain. The businessman next to her suddenly spoke. "Long trip ahead, huh?" Emma blinked and nodded. "Yeah, long year, actually." He chuckled softly, unaware of the truth behind her words. "Vacation or work?" "Neither," she replied after a pause. "Just going home." He smiled politely and turned back to his phone. Emma stared at the seat in front of her, her reflection faintly visible in the screen's glare. She barely recognized the woman looking back, tired eyes, faint lines of grief, and a quiet strength that no one else could see. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The loss, the guilt, the love for the people she'd tried to save. Tears gathered at the corner of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She didn't want to draw attention. She was just a nurse in C-25C. Nothing more. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Every life she'd touched, every goodbye she'd witnessed, had changed her. She carried the stories of the fallen in her heartbeat. And maybe, just maybe, fate wasn't done with her yet. Because somewhere in the endless blue sky outside that window, an F-15 pilot was flying, a man who would soon change everything. A man whose life was forever tied to the name written in her notebook. And before this flight landed, their worlds would collide in a moment that no one on board would ever forget. For now, though, she just sat quietly, watching the clouds drift by, holding onto memories the way others held onto hope. C-25C looked ordinary. But in that seat sat a woman who had already lived 1,000 lives, and was about to live one more that would make history in the skies. The sky outside was endless, a soft ocean of white clouds stretching as far as Emma Collins could see. For the first time in months, she was starting to feel something close to calm. The hum of the engines, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional laugh from a child, it was ordinary. Comfortingly ordinary. She took another sip of water, the coolness grounding her. Maybe this flight would finally be the moment she could breathe again. But peace, she had learned, never lasted long. Not for people who had seen what she had seen. About 2 hours into the flight, Emma opened her notebook again. The list of names stared back at her, 6 soldiers, 6 ghosts that never left her side. She pressed her palm over Lieutenant Ryan Keller's name. His brother's name, Mark Keller, was scribbled just beneath it in smaller letters. She didn't even know why she'd written it, just something she'd done the night she left the base, as if writing it down would make her remember to deliver the message she'd promised. The plane tilted slightly as it adjusted course. The sunlight shifted across the cabin, glinting off metal armrests and window frames. Passengers stirred, stretching their legs, murmuring quietly. Then, suddenly, a faint rumble. Not the steady thrum of the plane's own engines, but a deep, distant roar, echoing from somewhere outside. Emma frowned and looked up. The sound grew louder. The businessman beside her looked up too, confusion flickering across his face. "What was that?" he muttered. Before she could answer, the intercom crackled. "Greater than, ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's calm but uncertain voice, "this is your captain speaking. We've just been contacted by air traffic control. Everything is fine, but we're about to have a brief military escort as part of standard protocol. Please remain seated." A murmur swept through the cabin, soft, uneasy laughter, whispers of, "What's going on?" And, "Military escort, for us." Emma's heartbeat quickened. Military escort, on a civilian flight, that was unusual. She leaned toward the window, her pulse rising. At first, she saw nothing but blue. Then, a flash of metal. A streak of silver cutting through the clouds. And then another. 2 F-15 Eagles emerged from the mist, sleek and powerful, gliding alongside the passenger jet like guardian angels in formation. The sunlight caught their wings, and for a moment, the entire cabin gasped. Children pressed their faces to the windows. Passengers craned their necks, phones raised, capturing shaky videos. The air buzzed with excitement and confusion. "Whoa," the businessman whispered beside her. "That's close. They're right next to us." Emma couldn't tear her eyes away. She knew that silhouette, the proud twin tails, the long sleek fuselage, the insignia near the cockpit. She had seen them before, roaring above dusty runways, carrying pilots who were just names and smiles to her, until they weren't anymore. The F-15s stayed parallel with the airliner, their wings level, their presence both comforting and haunting. Then, something unexpected happened. The captain's voice returned, this time softer, almost reverent. "Greater than, ladies and gentlemen, if you look to the right side of the aircraft, the lead F-15 pilot has requested your attention." The passengers on the right side turned, murmuring in disbelief. Through the window, the lead F-15 began to inch closer, close enough for its markings to be visible. Emma's breath caught when she saw the insignia, the 122nd Fighter Wing. Her throat tightened. That was his unit, Captain Mark Keller's unit. She gripped the edge of her seat. "No," she whispered under her breath. The fighter jet steadied itself, flying wingtip to wingtip with the commercial plane. And then, through the canopy glass, they saw the pilot. His visor was down, but he raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, and snapped a crisp salute. Not to the passengers, not to the plane, but directly towards C-25C. Emma froze. Every sound in the cabin faded into silence. Even the engine hum seemed to disappear. It was just her, and that salute. Her heart pounded as tears blurred her vision. She could barely breathe. How could he know? How could he possibly? The businessman beside her turned. "Ma'am, is he saluting you?" She couldn't answer. She just stared, her hand trembling over the window. The captain's voice came again, this time quieter, his tone filled with something between awe and sorrow. "Greater than, for those wondering, the pilot of that F-15 is Captain Mark Keller. His brother, Lieutenant Ryan Keller, was a soldier who didn't make it home last year. The nurse who held him in his final moments happens to be on this very flight. Her name is Emma Collins." Gasps filled the cabin. Some passengers covered their mouths. Others looked toward Emma, realization dawning in their eyes. She sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The world around her had fallen away, the seats, the passengers, the plane. It was just her and that jet, locked in a moment that time itself seemed to hold still. The pilot held his salute for several long seconds. Then, he lowered his hand, dipped the nose of his aircraft slightly, a gesture of honor, and pulled away, the twin jets banking gracefully upward into the clouds. Emma pressed her hand to the window, whispering through tears, "He made it home, Captain. I promised." The cabin was utterly silent. No one clapped. No one spoke. There was no need. The air itself was thick with something sacred, a mix of grief, pride, and awe. The businessman beside her swallowed hard. "Ma'am, thank you, for whatever you did." She managed a faint smile, her voice barely a whisper. "I just did my job." But deep inside, she knew it was more than that. It wasn't just a salute. It was a connection, a bridge between two brothers, carried through war and loss, and somehow reunited in the quiet sky above the clouds. The captain came on again, his voice breaking slightly. "Greater than, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the crew, and the U.S. Air Force, we'd like to dedicate this flight to the men and women who serve, and to the healers who bring them home. Thank you." The intercom clicked off. Emma sat back, eyes closed, the weight of the moment still pressing against her chest. For the first time since leaving the base, she felt something shift, something inside her finally beginning to heal. She looked once more out the window, half expecting to see the jets again. But there was only blue sky and sunlight. Still, she knew they were out there somewhere, flying strong. The passenger across the aisle leaned toward her. "You're a nurse." She nodded softly. "I was." The woman smiled through tears. "No, you are." Emma turned back to the window, a faint, bittersweet smile on her lips. The flight continued in silence, but something in the air had changed. It wasn't just another commercial flight anymore. It was a story, one that every passenger would tell for the rest of their lives. Somewhere above them, Captain Mark Keller and his wingmen flew on, carrying their salute through the sky, a message of respect, love, and memory. And below, in C-25C, the woman who had once held his brother's hand whispered a quiet prayer into the sunlight. Rest easy, Ryan, he knows now. She closed her eyes as the engines hummed softly beneath her. For the first time in a long time, the sound didn't remind her of war. It sounded like peace. And for Emma Collins, the nurse in C-25C, peace was the rarest gift of all. For a long moment after the two F-15s vanished into the clouds, no one on the plane moved. The air inside the cabin felt different, thicker somehow, charged with emotion too deep for words. Even the children had gone quiet, their small faces pressed against the windows, searching the skies for the silver wings that had disappeared into the bright horizon. Emma Collins sat motionless in C-25C, her fingers still resting on the cold windowpane. The outline of the pilot's salute replayed in her mind over and over again like a heartbeat she couldn't silence. She tried to steady her breathing, but every inhale brought back memories she thought she had buried in the desert sands of the battlefield. The businessman beside her broke the silence first. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice trembling, "I think the whole plane owes you a thank you." Emma turned to him slowly, her eyes still shining with unshed tears. "Please," she whispered, "I'm no hero. I just held on when others couldn't." He nodded respectfully, then looked away, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. A flight attendant approached a few minutes later. Her eyes were red, her mascara smudged. She leaned closer and spoke in a hushed tone, "Captain wants you to know, he's honored to have you on board." Then, after a small pause, she added, "We all are." Emma managed a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The attendant squeezed her hand before walking away. Outside, the sun began to dip lower, painting the clouds in shades of gold and violet. The cabin lights dimmed, passengers whispered among themselves, telling and retelling what they had just witnessed. Somewhere near the back, a man began to quietly hum "America the Beautiful." Others joined, not singing, but listening, breathing in the stillness of that fragile unity that war and peace alike could never quite destroy. Emma closed her notebook slowly, tracing the names one last time before slipping it back into her bag. But the name Lieutenant Ryan Keller seemed to glow in her mind's eye, more alive than ever. She pictured him again in that field hospital, dirt on his face, pain in his voice, and that half-smile he'd managed before whispering his last words. "Tell my brother I'm proud of him." She had carried that sentence like a burden, a promise carved into her heart. And now, somewhere in the endless sky above, his brother had answered. The circle was complete, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she owed him more, a final act, a final truth that only she could deliver. The captain's voice came through the intercom once more, gentler now. "Greater than, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again. We've just received confirmation that the F-15 pilots have returned safely to their base. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to extend our gratitude to Miss Collins for her service. Sometimes the sky brings people together in ways we can't explain." The cabin erupted, not in cheers, but in applause. Slow, soft, heartfelt applause that swelled like a heartbeat through the aisles. Emma tried to sink into her seat, embarrassed, but the sound surrounded her. People nodded to her, some with tears, some with smiles. She pressed her hand to her heart, whispering, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure if she meant the passengers, the pilot, or the heavens themselves. The arrival. Hours later, the plane began its descent. The city lights of Washington, D.C. glittered below, tiny and far away, like stars that had fallen to earth. Emma stared down at them, thinking how strange it was that the world kept turning even when hearts stood still. When the wheels touched the runway, a ripple of relief and emotion went through the cabin. The flight attendants thanked everyone for flying, their voices thick with emotion. People stood to collect their bags, but no one rushed to leave. It was as if they all understood they had shared something rare, something holy. Emma waited until most passengers had gone. As she reached for her carry-on, she noticed a folded note on her tray table. Her name was written in neat block letters. To Nurse Emma Collins. She frowned and opened it carefully. "Greater than, ma'am, Captain Keller asked our tower to deliver this message through flight control. His words were simple: thank you for keeping my brother safe, even when I couldn't. He said you would understand. Flight Operations Control." Her hands shook as she read it again. The paper trembled in her grasp, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. She folded the note carefully and slipped it inside her notebook, right beside Ryan's name. As she walked toward the exit, the pilot of the commercial flight waited by the door. He extended his hand. "Miss Collins, he said quietly, "It's been an honor." "The honor's mine," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. Before stepping out, she turned once more to look down the aisle. C-25C glowed softly under the overhead light. For a moment, she imagined Ryan sitting there, smiling, whole, alive. Then she blinked, and the seat was empty again. The airport. The terminal was almost silent when she walked through it. Night had settled over the city, and the glass walls reflected her weary face as she moved toward baggage claim. The world outside was still awake, screens flickered, cars honked, but inside Emma's chest, everything was calm. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It read simply, "Greater than, this is Captain Mark Keller. I never got to say thank you in person. If you're still in DC, please meet me tomorrow at Arlington." Section 60. Emma's breath caught. Section 60, the part of Arlington National Cemetery reserved for the men and women lost in recent wars. She typed back, "I'll be there." The next morning. The following day dawned gray and quiet. A fine mist drifted across the grass as Emma walked between rows of white headstones. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind she used to pick as a girl before she ever knew what war smelled like. She found Lieutenant Ryan Keller's grave easily. The flag beside it fluttered in the soft wind. She knelt down, placed the flowers, and whispered, "I kept my promise." Footsteps approached behind her. She turned. A man in an Air Force uniform stood a few paces away. Tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, but when he removed them, she recognized the same shade of blue she had seen in Ryan's. "Captain Keller?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "You must be Emma." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of distant traffic mixed with birdsong and the whisper of the wind through the rows of marble. "I saw you yesterday," he said finally. "I didn't know what to say. That salute was the only thing that felt right." "You didn't have to say anything," she replied gently. "He knew you'd come home." Mark's voice trembled. "He talked about me." Emma smiled sadly. "Every chance he got. He was proud of you. He wanted you to keep flying." Mark looked away, blinking rapidly. "He was the brave one. I just survived." "You both did," she said. "In your own ways." They stood there for a while in silence. The world seemed to pause around them, two strangers bound by one memory, one promise, one shared loss. Finally, Mark reached into his jacket and handed her a small metal badge. He carried this in his pocket during every mission. "I think it belongs with you now." Emma looked down at the insignia, scratched, worn, still gleaming faintly. She closed her fingers around it, feeling its weight. "Thank you," she whispered. "But it belongs here." She placed it gently at the base of the headstone. Mark nodded. "You're right." They stood side by side as the clouds broke open and sunlight streamed through, bathing the rows of graves in gold. Neither spoke again. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Epilogue. Later that day, Emma sat on a bench near the reflecting pool, watching planes trace white lines high across the sky. Somewhere up there, she imagined Captain Keller in his jet, flying steady, strong, guarding the peace his brother had died for. She pulled her notebook from her bag and turned to the back page. Beneath the 6 names, she added one more line. "Greater than peace is not the absence of war, it's the moment when love outlasts loss." Then she closed the book for the final time. For the first time in years, the heaviness inside her lifted. Emma Collins, the nurse from C-25C, smiled through her tears. The world was vast, cruel, and beautiful all at once, but she had found her place in it again. As the sun set behind the city, she whispered a final goodbye to the brothers Keller and to all the soldiers whose faces she would never forget. And high above, as another jet crossed the fading sky, she imagined a salute, one last, silent gesture of gratitude from the heavens.